Forward to this interview. Alan Eisenstock is not only the author of many books, and I mean, I've even seen his cameo in a few movies and such, but the book that I'm holding up here for our Facebook viewers, it's called Sports Talk, an inside journey a journey inside the world of sports talk radio, which is something that I read, and it was certainly of Dodgers games in the 70s and such. But what was the motivation to write about sports talk radio? Because to my surprise, there hasn't been that many books about it.
Well, first of all, hi, Marky. Thank you for having me on. I was a nut that has me so kind of obsessed. And that's what it was for me. It was to just find out who these people were. And actually, not just the hosts, but also...
I don't really care what Joe from Sulphur Springs does. His opinion probably isn't as knowledgeable as mine. If that sounds egotistical, so be it.
No, but I think that's 100% correct, and it was always my question.
Yeah.
Exactly that question, which was, why aren't you listening to the host? If the host is worth anything, that's who you should be listening to. But having said that, when I wrote the book, so much of sports talk radio was driven by the caller. When I went and interviewed Mike and the Mad Dog, which was in itself a fascinating week that I spent because they literally couldn't be in the same room with each other. But they, except when they were on the air. And so they had a ton of callers. Rome had a ton of callers at the time. JT the Brick had tons of callers, and he still does. But that's all changed. Rome has almost no callers. And I think Chris Russo, he's pretty much not doing callers either. So you're right. I think Joe Schmedrick from...
started in 1991 with the advent of ESPN Sports Radio. But I can remember in the 80s, for instance, and I know you're out in the West, so you may not be as familiar with this guy as I am, but Pete Franklin out of Cleveland or St. Louis or New York. And I mean, he used to brag, I talked to more sports fans than anyone. Now, you got that was the beginning of his show. I mean, that was his lead-in.
I remember.
And what I got from that was, and I learned this, and Rush Limbaugh used to always say this, the callers are supposed to make the host look good. So the caller would therefore be the dupe and all this. Now, back in the day, I will tell you that caller to a competing talk doing his show basically, here, will you call in and let's talk? I mean, it's sort of the old-fashioned style of sports talk radio that is being done by one of my competitors. That's how I got to be known. I was probably the first regular sports talk caller in the Tri-Cities market.
Of the day or the email of the day, that was one of the staples for a while. I think that you're right. I mean, it's hard to engage when you're just on social media. And I love what you just said because, JT the Brick also started as a caller for Rome. And Eddie Andelman, who claims to be the one who really started sports talk radio, and I spent time with Eddie when I wrote the book, he loved to do prank calls. And that's kind of how he started with the sport. So he would do all sorts of crazy calls, and he would dupe people.
Given way to the Chevalier, that was always someone, and he always had the decent as well. So, and the Vegas scene and all that, that was somebody that was, if you could get him, it was a fun listen to and such that you mentioned. And so, but one of the things that I liked is your take with Mike North. And in fact, this is what brought me into mind the other day. I had a situation, it was a press conference, and a basketball coach here, Steve Ford, one of my questions. Mike North, Pat Riley, if you could come back and beat the Jordan Bulls in this series, would you shave your head? And it was talked about as an unprofessional question at the time. I remember hearing about it, and I was like, what in the world? But you know what? Freedom of speech, you got to have no limits in asking. There's also no limit. North question, so criticized at the time. Brilliant. Where did you come up with that creativity? How did you come up with, did you think that at the time when North asked the question of Riley back, I think it was 97?
Well, I don't know exactly my thought process. It seemed like a question out of literature.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like the O. Henry question out of the great, the gift of the Magi, which would you give up your most prized possession for the thing you most loved, or in this case, the thing that you most cherished? And it seems so perfect. And it was so ironic coming from Mike North, who was, he was a hot dog vendor who ultimately ended up as the #1 sports talk radio host in the Midwest, really. This was I was in Chicago interviewing all these from Mike. And Mike said, you can't do a book on sports talk radio unless you interview me. So I canceled my flight back to LA, and he ended up taking me to his apartment, and we had a long interview, and one of the great consistencies I found with sports talk radio hosts, and I'll put present company aside, but everybody was incredibly egotistical and insecure, and everybody at the time claimed that they had the biggest TV, and they would ask you about it. Mike North would say,
myself, where I've had people come up to me and, hey, how do I get started in this? And I go, hey, 9 years ago, you told me off the air, maybe you weren't the passionate sports talk radio listener you once were. Maybe that's even myself as well. I mean, do I listen to other shows? Absolutely. Am I trying to learn what's going on in the sports world through this? That sort of thing. But still, let me ask, what do you think the future of this format is? It's gone from being caller-generated to host-generated. I don't know. Is it going, do you have any ideas about, will we still have that sort of, maybe caustic style in the future? Will it get friendlier? Will it get even more caustic? Where do you see the format going in the future?
Well, I mean, it's hard to predict the future, but it's very hard to see a world without sports talk radio as long as people are so passionate about their sport. It is really a local thing. And as long as you've got talk about it, and so it doesn't really matter even which particular sport it is. Certain markets are more, are heavier in football, others basketball, others in college football. So I just can't see the end to sports talk radio. I mean, you mentioned social media before, and I know that what happens a lot of times, even to me, is, I'm from New England, I'm a passionate New England sports fan, so I really like tweeting during a game with other people when a Red Sox game.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes, if the game is boring, the tweeting isn't. So but I think there always will be a connection, and as long as you have an interesting voice, and I mean that not necessarily, but if what your take is, what your perspective on sports, as long as you have something that's interesting, you can carry sports talk radio and people will listen because people care about their sports teams. And they want to know, they want to get information, they want to get insight, they want to get a perspective that they hadn't thought.
And that's one of the things that I always wanted to be the local sports talk host, because, you can have as a national, okay, let's talk about the NBA playoffs, or, the Bruins are up 3-0 on the Hurricanes. I guess, they've got to be the favorite for the cup or whatever. Looks like the Canes run is going to be over. Draft lottery or something, but there isn't the quote-unquote influence. I've always looked at the influence, just around here, what I think is, after I made some headlines after a coach snapped at me, and such, people started talking about, now wait a minute, we like Marky Billson because he asks aren't. And I'd like to think locally, okay, maybe I'm improving the state of sports journalism. There you go with the big ego and all that. But it is something that could have an impact on the local scene. That's my point there, okay? I don't know if...
That's happened. You're bringing up such an interesting point, and I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Sure.
Let's say a team will be interested in making a change of manager, let's say, or doing a trade.
Sure.
If the audience through sports talk radio makes a huge public outcry against it, that, management listens. It's happened, but people will say, you know what, we heard that, we don't want to hire this particular guy as our new manager or something, and we heard it on sports talk radio.
Good point of that is Clay Travis, who does Outkick the coverage for us every morning. I mean, he was a big leader in the "Don't you dare hire Greg Schiano to be the Tennessee football coach," that movement, which I think did primarily take place on Twitter. But hey, it started from a sports talk show host. He had to have the audience that started the movement, be it on social media or whatnot. And I know that Travis is national, but he certainly was looking at a local issue, and he certainly was being the local Tennessee host at that period of time. I don't know if Jim Rome, he can have a poignant comment on whatever national scene, but I don't know if that, say, Clay Travis did back then. He's Alan Eisenstock. Yes. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say you're 100% right. I don't think Rome would have that impact. But, if there's going to be some sort of with a hiring thing or something like that going on with your local team, people do listen. Sports remains our common denominator. It's the one thing that we can get passionate about and talk about, no matter what what your financial situation is. We have equal access to our sports team and our sports opinion. The CEO of a major company can have a conversation about sports with the janitor of his or her company.
That's a good point right there. Well, I was going to say Alan Eisenstock. I was going to wrap this up. I'm way overdue, but I got to ask you this. I know you're not watching on Facebook, but if you do, on our 1420 WEMB Sports Radio Facebook page, you will see that I am right now wearing the tie that Richard Dawson wore when he met his second wife, Gretchen, on Family Feud. So I got to ask you, you wrote the Angie episode with Richard Dawson and Family Feud. I got to ask you this. How'd that all come about?
I don't think I did write that episode.
I saw DVD. I thought it was.
No, I don't think I wrote that episode.
Well, they gave somebody the wrong credit then. There was a mistake right there.
You find that a lot, and I am MD. But yeah, I'll answer your question because I don't think I wrote that episode.
But the Raiders...
I did, and I was too stoned, and I don't remember.
But the Raiders are the team with the ugly helmets against the Tampa...
That I do remember.
That one you did right, and what's happening and all this. Yeah, that was the line right there. And for that matter, I've always now regretted that the Buccaneers changed their helmets. It's nice to meet someone else who does as well. Tri-City Sports Now.